He found a young widow sleeping beside his horse, then heard her whisper his late wife's name. Colorado Territory, winter of 1868, near an abandoned stage stop. The wind howled down from the mountains, sharp and clean, dragging snow across the old fence posts like a ghost, searching for something lost. The sun hadn't yet cleared the ridge when Joseph Blackwood stepped out of his cabin, heavy boots crunching on frost-hardened ground. The path to the stable was nearly buried after the night's storm, but he walked it without hesitation. He had walked it every morning for 4 years. Joseph lived alone now, the kind of solitude a man didn't choose, but didn't escape either. After Margaret died, he moved into the hills and took the silence with him. He pushed open the stable door. The scent of hay and horse greeted him, warm and familiar. But there was something else. Movement, not the horse, something huddled in the straw. He reached for the knife at his belt and stepped inside. She was young, no more than 23, maybe younger under the dirt and cold. Wrapped in a torn wool shawl, her clothes soaked and rimmed with ice, she lay curled beside his horse like a stray animal. Her boots were missing, toes wrapped in cloth. Her fingers clutched the saddle blanket like it might save her from freezing. Joseph knelt, uncertain whether she was alive. Then her lips moved. Barely audible. A breath, not a sentence. "Margaret, forgive me." Joseph froze. His hand, halfway to her shoulder, stayed suspended in the air. Margaret. His wife's name? No one here knew that name. Not anymore. His chest tightened. He stood slowly, retreating 2 steps like the ground had shifted beneath him. He stared at her like she wasn't a woman at all, but something summoned out of the past. Her face, in the lantern light, was pale and worn, but unfamiliar. Still, her voice clung to the name like it was sacred. She stirred, eyes fluttering open. When she saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, with soot-stained hands and a face like weathered stone, she gasped. She tried to rise, but her legs gave out. "Stay back!" she cried hoarsely, crawling toward the wall. Joseph didn't move. She reached for a broken pitchfork near the hay pile, more instinct than strategy, but her hands were shaking too hard to lift it. He raised one hand slowly, not in threat, but to stop her from running. He spoke for the first time, his voice low and steady. "Why did you say that name?" She froze, her breath caught in her throat. "What?" He stepped closer, no weapon drawn, only eyes locked on hers. "Margaret, that's my wife's name. She's been dead 4 winters. No one here speaks it. So I'll ask you again." He paused, the weight of memory in every syllable. "Why do you know her name?" The woman stared at him, wide-eyed, lips parted in shock. The wind pushed at the door behind them, moaning low like a warning. Joseph stood still, waiting. And the ghost of a name hung between them like smoke that refused to clear. Joseph stood silent as the woman stared back at him. Her lips trembled, and for a moment he thought she might faint. Instead, she swallowed hard and sat up straighter, arms wrapping around her knees. "My name is Lena," she said at last, voice rough. "Lena Hart." The name landed like a stone in Joseph's chest. He knew it, not well, but enough. She had been one of the housemaids, quiet, clumsy, always with her head down, barely more than a girl back then. Margaret had taken a liking to her, tried to teach her to read, to bake. And then, after the fire, no one ever saw her again. "You were supposed to be dead," Joseph said, his voice low, disbelieving. Lena nodded. "Everyone thought I died in the fire. I let them think it." His jaw clenched. "Why?" She looked down, ashamed. "Because I caused it." Joseph's fists curled at his sides. The words scraped through him like grit on iron. She took a deep breath, her voice thin. "I was in the kitchen. It was late. Margaret had gone to bed. I dropped a candle while fetching something from the shelf. It landed near the drapes. I tried to put it out, but it caught fast. The oil lamp was too close. Everything just went up." Joseph's breath came hard and fast now. "I panicked," she whispered. I ran. I didn't think anyone was still inside, but Margaret, she must have gone back in, looking for me. Lena buried her face in her hands. I've lived with that night in my head every day since. I don't sleep without seeing her eyes. I don't eat without feeling like I've stolen from someone who should still be alive. Joseph turned away from her, staring at the beams of sunlight cutting through the stable's roof slats. The dust spun like embers, hanging in the cold morning light. She died in that house, he said. She burned. I buried what was left. Lena's shoulders shook. I know. The silence that followed was thick, slow-moving. The only sounds were the shuffle of the horse's hooves and the groan of wind dragging through cracks in the wood. Joseph felt something heavy press into his ribs. Not rage, not yet. Something slower, a kind of unraveling. He had dreamt so many times of someone to blame, a face he could yell at, fists he could strike. But now that face was here, and it was not hardened or cruel. It was small, pale, wrapped in guilt. Still, his voice came out flint-sharp. You should have stayed, faced it. I was 17, she said softly. I didn't even know how to ride. I just ran. I've been running since. He stepped toward her, not quickly, not kindly, just moved, and reached for the stable door. Come on, he said. Lena blinked up at him, confused. What? He opened the door wider. Get out. She stood slowly, nodding, not surprised. I understand. She took 2 steps into the snow, pulling the shawl tighter around her, head bowed. Joseph watched her for a beat. Snowflakes began to settle on her shoulders. Then, if you really want forgiveness. She stopped. Stay. She turned, eyes wide. We're not done, he said. There's still truth buried somewhere in those ashes, and I intend to find it. Lena looked at him, unsure whether he was offering mercy or punishment. But she stepped back inside, and the stable door closed behind her. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Joseph poured water from a tin pail into a kettle over the coals, and Lena sat near the wall, shivering more from nerves than cold. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was waiting. Finally, Joseph said, without looking at her, You'll stay in the loft. There's a cot. She nodded. And tomorrow, he added, we go back. To the house. Lena's fingers gripped the hem of her shawl. I didn't think it was still standing. It's not, Joseph said quietly, but the bones are. Up above, snow slid softly off the roof. Somewhere in the woods, a coyote called. And beneath that old stage-stop roof, 2 people who had only known each other as echoes of tragedy now sat in the first hour of something else. Not forgiveness yet, not healing, but the beginning of a reckoning. The snow crunched underfoot as Joseph and Lena made their way down the narrow trail. Pine trees bowed under the weight of winter, silent sentinels bearing witness. The path curved through the woods until it opened onto a clearing. There, standing like a grave monument, was the skeleton of the house. Charred beams jutted from the ground. The stone foundation remained, blackened by soot, and in the center lay a mound of snow-dusted ash and twisted iron, all that was left of a life once lived. Lena stopped at the edge of the clearing, her breath catching in her throat. Her legs trembled. Joseph walked ahead, boots crunching over frozen cinders. This is where it happened, he said, 4 winters ago. Lena stepped slowly into the ruin. Her eyes darted to the spot where the hearth used to be, to the empty ring that once held Margaret's rocking chair. Every stone, every shadow, whispered her name. I used to stand there, Lena said, pointing to a cracked flagstone near the wall. Washing dishes, watching the snow fall through that little window. Joseph didn't respond. He sat down heavily on a half-burned log near the back wall, his hands clasped between his knees. She ran back in, he said quietly. Lena turned to him. She had made it out, he continued. But she didn't see you, thought you were still upstairs. She turned and ran straight through the flames. I was away at the forge that night. When I got back, all that was left was smoke and silence. Lena sank to her knees. Her tears came freely now, steaming against the cold. "I didn't know," she choked. "I thought she'd escaped. I thought it was just me who ran." Joseph's voice was steady, but hollow. "For 4 years I fed my grief with your face. Every time I hammered iron, it was your name on the anvil. I cursed you every morning, hated you every night." He looked at her, eyes raw. "I lived just to hate you." Lena couldn't speak. She bent forward, pressing her forehead to the icy stone, sobbing. Joseph stood slowly, walking toward the ruined hearth. Something caught his boot, a small jutting rock, out of place. He bent down, brushing away the snow. There, half buried in the ash, was a metal edge. He dug around it with his hands, revealing a rusted tin box, scorched but intact. His breath caught. "I remember this," he said, brushing soot from the lid. "She kept her letters in here, her journals." He glanced at Lena, then knelt and pried it open. Most of the contents had been reduced to ash, edges curled and black, but one page remained, singed at the corners, ink faded but legible. Joseph read aloud, voice trembling. "Lena is young, clumsy, yes, but kind. Joseph does not see it yet. He thinks only in right and wrong. But I believe she carries more fear than fault. Something in this house is not right. I hear noises when I am alone. I feel watched. Tonight, I will speak to her. I think she knows something, even if she doesn't understand it." Lena raised her head slowly, eyes wide with disbelief. "She never blamed you," Joseph said softly. "She suspected something else." The page fluttered in his hand as a wind passed through the ruins. Lena stood, staring at the letter. "I thought I had killed her," she whispered. "But someone else was there that night." Joseph looked toward the woods beyond the clearing, his jaw tightening. "Then it's time we stop living in the ashes," he said, "and find the truth still buried beneath them." The wind had softened, but the snow still fell, quiet, steady. Joseph and Lena stood before the skeleton of what once was a house. Only the blackened foundation remained, framed by scorched stone and the twisted remains of beams, now half buried in white. Joseph said nothing. He simply stepped aside and let her walk ahead. Lena's breath caught when she saw the broken pillar where Margaret had once hung the brass kitchen bell, its outline still visible in scorched metal. Her fingers trembled. She stepped onto the ruin, each footfall stirring up soot beneath the snow. Her eyes welled with tears. "I remember now," she whispered. "That night, I was making stew. The oil popped, startled me. I dropped the pan. It hit the rug. The fire spread so fast." Her voice broke. I really tried to stop it, but I panicked. I ran." Joseph remained silent, standing among the shadows of the past. "I thought I killed her," Lena said, falling to her knees on the cold stone. "She was kind to me, treated me like a daughter, and I left her there to burn." Joseph watched her for a long moment. His face held no anger, but something deeper, the weight of years carried alone. Then, without a word, he knelt by the old fireplace. He dug beneath the rubble with gloved hands, moving aside a layer of soot and fractured tiles. Lena looked up, puzzled. From the ashes, he pulled a small, rusted tin box. Its lid was blackened, dented. Joseph opened it slowly. Inside were burned fragments, pages of Margaret's journal, most turned to ash. But one page, singed at the edges, remained intact. He read aloud, his voice low. "Lena is clumsy but good-hearted. Joseph seems cold with her, but I see she's just afraid. Tonight, I plan to speak to her. I feel something is wrong, something lurking in this house that we haven't yet seen." Lena froze. "She wrote that?" Joseph nodded and handed her the page. Lena stared at the words, her lips trembling. She didn't blame me?" "No," Joseph said softly. She knew something else was at play. Lena's mind began to race, fragments of forgotten memory rising like smoke. The sound of heavy boots outside. The back door creaking open while she had been upstairs. A shadow moving through the hall. She had told herself it was nothing. But now, she suspected someone, Lena murmured. Joseph's voice turned colder. She told me there were people she didn't trust, especially someone from town, but she never had proof. She didn't want to worry me unless she was certain. Tears spilled down Lena's face, but this time they were not only of guilt, but of clarity. All this time, she whispered, I carried a ghost that never pointed a finger at me. Joseph reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. You were the last person Margaret tried to save, he said. If she ran back into that house, it was for you. That means something. Crumpling forward, Lena sobbed openly. Joseph helped her to her feet, brushing soot from her coat. His voice, firm but steady, If you had the courage to come back here, then maybe we have the strength to face what's still hidden. Their eyes met. For her, he said. Lena nodded. Her hand tightened around the half-burned page, pressed to her heart. They stood in silence, snow settling around them, not just over ash and ruin, but over something else. A truth that had waited 4 years beneath the charred stone. The snow had lessened by the time they returned to Joseph's cabin nestled in the pine-covered hills. Smoke curled gently from the chimney, the scent of iron and wood smoke hanging in the air. Inside, warmth wrapped around them, not just from the fire, but from something quieter growing between them. Lena moved through the cabin as though trying not to leave footprints. Each day, she took to small tasks, sweeping the hearth, mending Joseph's worn leather gloves, preparing simple stews. She was careful, unobtrusive. But Joseph noticed how she remembered where Margaret once kept the sugar, or how she refolded the wool blankets just so. Sometimes, their hands brushed. Neither pulled away. One evening, as Joseph finished filing a horseshoe by lantern light, Lena brought in a dusty crate from the attic. I found this under the eaves, she said. Letters, some unopened. Joseph set down his tools and joined her. They opened the crate and began sorting through yellowed envelopes, mostly church notices, old bills, a few childhood sketches from Margaret's cousins back east. Then Lena paused, her fingers tightening around a thin, stained envelope. This one, it is not postmarked. Joseph took it, eyes narrowing. The paper was rough, the handwriting harsh, slanted, familiar. He opened it. Inside was a single note, no greeting, no signature. You open your mouth, your house burns next. Some fires don't go out. Joseph's jaw tightened. You recognize this? Lena asked, voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, slowly. Judson Caro. The liquor trader? Joseph's voice was low. Margaret once turned him in. He was swindling families, watering down barrels, charging triple, bullying women who couldn't pay. Lena's hands trembled. She never told me. She didn't want to scare you, or me. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Joseph stood. We are going to find him. The ride to town was long and quiet. They did not speak until the woods thinned and the path split near an abandoned lumber camp. Joseph dismounted and pointed. He lives out here now, keeps to himself. They followed the trail until a flicker of smoke curled above the trees. A crooked cabin leaned against the hill, its roof sagging under snow. Joseph knocked. The door creaked open. Judson stood there, older, heavier, but the same cold eyes. Well, he grunted. Didn't expect the mountain man and his shadow. Joseph didn't flinch. We found your letter. Judson smirked. You'll have to be more specific. Joseph stepped forward. The one you sent, Margaret, before the fire. At that, Judson's smile thinned. That woman always poked her nose where it didn't belong. Lena's voice cut through. You threatened her. And the fire, you were there. Judson scoffed. You think I torched that house? You think I had time to play arsonist? But then Lena's eyes lit with memory. There was someone outside the kitchen window. That night, I heard a step, then smelled kerosene. Judson's mouth twitched. You left the side door open, Lena added. Only someone who knew the house could have known where the pantry was, where the oil was stored. Judson's face hardened. Joseph's hands curled into fists. Judson chuckled bitterly. Some dumb maid drops a pan, starts a fire, and I just gave it a little help. What's the crime? She was about to run her mouth again. Lena's breath caught. Joseph's voice dropped to a calm, deadly quiet. My wife died because of your cowardice. Judson shrugged. She died because she thought people like you could save the world. Joseph took one step forward. No, she died trying to save someone who didn't deserve to burn. He turned away. Lena followed. Behind them, Judson's laughter echoed briefly in the trees, but neither of them looked back. The ride home was silent, but something had shifted. The guilt that had hung around Lena like a shadow now began to lift. The truth had been spoken, and it did not carry her name alone. Snow began to fall again as they rode back through the narrow trail between the trees. The flakes were softer now, drifting like ash from an old fire. By the time they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, the wind had picked up. Joseph pulled the reins and pointed to an old hunting cabin tucked into the slope. We can't make it back tonight, he said. We'll wait out the storm here. Lena nodded. Her face was pale, but her eyes held something steadier than they had before. They tied the horses under the lean-to, then stepped inside the one-room shack. Abandoned, dusty, but still standing. Joseph found a few logs left by the last traveler and lit a fire in the stone hearth. They sat in silence for a while, facing the flames, listening to the wind batter the walls. Lena pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The warmth from the fire hadn't yet reached the chill buried inside her. After a long pause, she whispered, "Why aren't you angry with me?" Joseph didn't answer right away. His gaze remained on the fire. If I hadn't spilled that pot, if I had stayed to help, maybe Margaret would still be alive, she said. I think about it every night. Joseph finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. I was angry, he said softly. I spent years turning that anger into steel. Every horseshoe, every nail I forged, it all carried her name, or yours. Lena's breath hitched. He continued, but something kept gnawing at me. Margaret was not a woman who gave herself to fear. She ran back into a burning house to save someone. That someone was you. Lena lowered her eyes. Her hands trembled. Joseph shifted closer, his voice low but firm. She didn't choose wrong. Lena blinked rapidly. You don't understand. I was nothing to her. Just a clumsy girl who couldn't keep a fire going without setting a house on fire. Joseph reached out and took her hand, gently. You were young, afraid, and now you've carried the weight of that night longer than any one person should have to. But Margaret, she saw something worth saving. Tears filled Lena's eyes. They slipped down her cheeks quietly. I tried to run from it. I thought if I disappeared, maybe the guilt would fade, but it didn't. It only grew stronger. Joseph nodded slowly. Because the fire didn't just take her, it left both of us behind. Outside, the wind howled louder, but inside, a stillness settled over them. Lena looked at him, truly looked, not as the man she once served, or the grieving husband she feared, but as someone who had walked through the same fire. Joseph's gaze was steady, his hand still holding hers. You came back, he said. You faced it. That means something. She whispered. It doesn't erase what I did. No, he replied, but it shows who you are now. Their hands remained entwined. No rush, no declarations, just presence. Later that night, they lay down on opposite sides of the cabin floor. The fire still crackled. Wind still moaned through the cracks. But the cold didn't bite as harshly. At some point, their hands found each other again beneath the blanket. There were no kisses, no fevered touches. Only breath, shared warmth, and a quiet understanding that something broken had started to mend. And in that space between guilt and forgiveness, winter no longer felt so cold. Spring began to tease the edges of winter. Snow thinned into patches, and the wind no longer howled like grief through the pines. Joseph had started fixing up the old stage stop, the place where he had once found Lena curled beside his horse, half frozen and whispering ghosts. Now, that same place was becoming something else. He replaced broken beams, patched the roof with cedar shingles, and carved window frames by hand. It was still modest. Walls still bore the smell of dust and pine, but it stood tall, sturdy, warm. Lena stayed. Not by request. Not by invitation. She simply stayed, as if something rooted her there more deeply than words ever could. Each morning came with new sounds, not just the creak of old wood or the tapping of hammer and nail, but laughter, the clink of a tin mug being set beside a warming fire, the rustle of skirts moving through grass slowly returning from beneath the frost. One morning she sowed the first row of seeds in the thawed garden, squash, beans, and some wildflowers she found near the riverbank. Joseph watched from the porch as she hummed a quiet tune, the sun on her shoulders, sleeves rolled to her elbows. There was grace in her movement, a gentleness that defied the scars of what they had both endured. She baked small loaves of barley bread from a sack Joseph found in an abandoned trade post, wrapped them in cloth, and offered them to passing trappers or a hungry child from town. She stitched together curtains from a scorched sheet she had carried in her bag, once belonging to Margaret, and hung them above the new windows, softening the light. The corners were uneven. One had a patch, but they danced when the breeze moved through, catching the golden sunlight like a prayer. The house slowly became a home. Not rebuilt from ashes, but raised from them. Lena sang sometimes, quietly, almost shyly, as if testing the air to see if it would hold the sound. And it did. The walls, once silent, now held her voice like a promise. Joseph found himself smiling more often, not from joy, necessarily, but from peace, that rare, slow-growing thing that arrives not with a thunderclap, but with the steady rhythm of shared work, simple meals, and quiet company. One afternoon, when the clouds hung low and wind rustled through the pines, Lena walked alone to the cemetery on the ridge. The grave was modest, a flat stone etched with the name Margaret W. Harding. The dates blurred slightly by years of frost and sun. Beneath it, the earth was undisturbed, peaceful. Lena knelt and placed a folded handkerchief on the stone. Inside were dried wildflowers, lavender, red clover, sage. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But thank you for letting me live. I promise I will not waste what you gave me." She closed her eyes, letting the silence answer. Behind her, soft footsteps approached. Joseph stood a few paces back, hands in his coat pockets, eyes lowered with reverence. He didn't speak right away. Then he said quietly, "Margaret always believed in light, in kindness, even when no one else did." Lena turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. He added, "And I think maybe you're the part of that light she left behind." Lena's breath caught in her throat. The weight she'd carried, of guilt, of sorrow, didn't vanish, but shifted. Became something she could hold without being crushed beneath it. The wind shifted, brushing the dried petals gently. They stood together there, not as shadows of what was lost, but as people who had carried the weight of grief and somehow, without realizing, began to carry each other instead. As they walked back down the hill toward the little house in the clearing, the first buds of wildflowers began to show beneath the snowmelt. Yellow and white, timid at first, but certain. New roots. New life. And for the first time, neither of them looked back. Spring, real and full, had settled across the mountains. The snow was gone, replaced by soft moss and wild violets blooming along the path to the front steps. The little house Joseph rebuilt now stood wrapped in sunlight, its windows open to the breeze, curtains dancing like quiet laughter. Grass grew along the stone threshold. The smoke from the chimney no longer smelled of old pine and survival, but of bread baking, coffee warming, life continuing. Lena taught the valley children how to read and write. A few hours each week, she sat on a blanket in the yard with a slate in her lap, patient and firm. She didn't just teach letters, she taught gentleness, taught them to listen, to look at the world like it could still be good. Joseph, meanwhile, kept working the forge. He shod horses, sharpened tools, made knives for hunters passing through, but something had changed. The lines on his face had softened. His shoulders no longer carried every shadow alone. He smiled now. Not often, but when he did, it stayed. One morning, just as the sun crept up from behind the ridgeline, Lena stood under the porch roof, arms folded against the chill. She watched Joseph walk back from the creek, carrying a bucket of water, his boots wet with dew. He saw her waiting, and instead of passing by, he stopped. Without a word, he pulled a thin red cord from his pocket, dyed from crushed berries, frayed at the ends. Slowly, he wrapped it around her wrist and tied it once, then twice. She looked at him, wide-eyed. He said, "This was how my grandfather promised himself to my grandmother. No priest, no ceremony, just a thread and a vow." He tightened the knot gently. "You don't need to say anything," he added, "but this is your home now, and you are mine." Lena didn't speak. She didn't need to. She leaned into him, and he pulled her into his arms. No crowd, no witnesses. Just the wind, the pines, and two hearts that had been to hell and found their way back. Later that week, Joseph walked out to the road and took down the old sign nailed to the fence, the one that had hung crooked for years. For sale. He replaced it with a new one, carved by his own hands. The wood was dark, scorched at the edges, but smooth at the center, where he had etched 4 words: forged by fire, chosen by love. The porch door no longer creaked when it opened, and more importantly, it no longer locked, because they had nothing left to fear. No ghosts to keep out, no past to bury. Only 2 people, scarred and changed, but alive, who had found each other in the ashes. And loved like the fire had never taken anything at all. If this story of redemption, love, and second chances touched your heart, don't forget to hit that hype button. It helps us bring more untold stories from the Old West to life. And if you want more tales like, he found a young widow sleeping beside his horse, then heard her whisper his late wife's name, make sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories and turn on the bell so you never miss a single heartbeat beneath the dust and gunpowder. Thanks for riding with us. We'll see you on the next trail.